Good day, viewers. You are welcome to Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Today, we'll be talking economics and we'll be looking at the topic of supply. We'll be talking about the types of supply and the distinction between a movement along a supply curve and a shift in the supply curve.
Eko Learners Support, a support program of the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education for WAEC and NECO candidates.
The lesson objectives include that at the end of this lesson, you will be able to first list and also explain the types of supply with examples. You'll be able to list or identify and explain the factors affecting supply, and then you'll be able to explain the distinction between a movement along a particular supply curve and a shift in supply or shift in supply curve. So we are looking at types of supply right now, and the first is composite supply. I would say composite supply occurs in a case or a situation where a given commodity one can serve two or more purposes. We use crude oil as an example here, where crude oil or petroleum can be used to produce different other downline products: petrol, kerosene, diesel, lubrication oil, and so on. So the supply of crude oil is said to have composite supply. The next is joint or complementary supply, and this is a case where two or more commodities are produced and supplied from one source. One source of production for two or more different commodities, such that the supply of one will lead to the supply of the other. Again, crude oil or petroleum is a very good example, because the components of crude oil, you cannot produce one without having the other. So, in a bid to produce petrol, you have diesel produced. In a bid to produce diesel and petrol, you have lubrication oil produced, you have gas produced. So, these products are said to have joint or complementary supply. The third is competitive supply. And this occurs where many commodities are supplied for the satisfaction of a given want. Different commodities providing satisfaction for just a particular want. Thus, two or more commodities serve as substitutes. So if different commodities, A, B, and C, for example, can serve one particular want, it means if one is not available, if A, for instance, is not available, you can go for B. Where B and A are not available, you can go for C. So you say in this case that they have competitive supply. For example, one particular kind of cola, you can take one particular kind of cola or another type. So Pepsi, for instance, can be a substitute for Coke, because you can drink Coke instead of Pepsi, or Pepsi instead of Coke. Coke and Pepsi are therefore said to have competitive supply. Now, the factors that affect supply. What are those things that will make supply possible or not? The supply of a particular commodity available for offer for sale in the market is made possible or not based on the interference of certain factors. The first is the increase in price of inputs, which invariably affects the cost of production. What are inputs? Inputs are generally the raw materials or the materials that are required for the production of a particular commodity. For instance, cement needs limestone. Okay, so if access or the cost of getting limestone becomes expensive, this will affect the cost at which cement is produced. And this invariably, or in turn, can lead to whether you have cement available in the market or offered for sale in the market or not. The next is the prices of other commodities. Okay, this will happen in cases where you have substitutes, for instance, or complements. So, if, like the example we used earlier on of Pepsi and Coca-Cola, the price of Pepsi can invariably affect the supply of Coke because they are substitutes. So if the price of Coke goes down, it can affect the production or the availability or the offer or the quantity of Coke that is offered for sale in the market. The reverse can also be true. Then next you have weather conditions, usually affecting agricultural produce. In Nigeria, for instance, we notice that there are certain agricultural vegetables that are available in large quantity, offered for sale in large quantities in the market during the rainy season. And then when the rainy season and we go into the dry season, you begin to have a paucity of these products offered for sale in the market. So weather condition can affect fertility, can affect productivity of agricultural products, and therefore affect the supply of those products in the market. Weather conditions, for instance, can also affect transportation, which has a significant bearing on how some products are moved from where they are produced to the market. So supply can therefore be affected by weather conditions, especially in the case of agricultural products. Cost of production. What does it take to produce or to get the product out of the production line? The cost of production includes a number of things that we have already mentioned. For instance, the cost of inputs. So if the cost of the raw materials to produce a particular commodity is on the rise, it will invariably affect the cost of producing that commodity, which will also ultimately affect the supply of that commodity in the market. Available technology. Technology usually helps to cut down on production time and sometimes cost. Because when you have improved technology, it means you can get things done better, usually, and faster. Therefore, the level of technology that is involved in the production of a commodity can affect the supply of that commodity. Or, in other words, can affect the quantity of that commodity that is made available or offered for sale in the market. So if the level of technology is high, it cuts down on production time and possibly cost of production and removes human errors, for example, and therefore makes quantity available or offered for sale in the market to be high, and vice versa. The next is government subsidies. While not trying to go into politics, a lot of Nigerians are familiar with the case of petroleum subsidies. The government introduced petroleum subsidies with a view, with the intent of affecting the supply of petroleum products in the market. So the subsidies were given to cushion the cost effect of getting petrol into the market, into Nigeria, and therefore making it available in large quantity. So the availability of government subsidies can affect the quantity of a particular product or commodity that is available or offered for sale in the market. Taxation is another. To encourage availability, to improve supply, sometimes government gives what is referred to as tax holidays or tax rebates, allowing producers not to pay tax for a certain window or for a certain period of time, so that their cost of production is reduced, and therefore they can make a lot of the product available in the market. And then we have the number of producers. Competition comes in if you have a large number of producers of a given commodity in the market. Now, where you have a number of producers, sometimes producers have to become price takers. As a result of this, the offer for sale or the quantity supplied of the commodity in the market is impacted. Finally, natural disasters. In places or locations that are prone to natural disasters like earthquake and flooding, usually for agricultural products and other products. For instance, in mining, earthquakes disrupt activities or operations and therefore can impact negatively on the availability of mining products or the end products of mining. In agricultural use, flooding, for example, can destroy farmlands and thereby creating droughts or impacting on the availability of food in the market. So, we see that as producers put together the factors of production to get quantities of products available in the market, there are factors that can impact on this availability, either positively or negatively. And it is important that we understand how these factors impact on the availability or the supply of our products.
Acing your WAEC and NECO examinations has been made easy by the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education with the Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO Candidates television program. Join seasoned teachers as they take you through these core subjects, targeting the exact syllabus of WAEC and NECO. Watch Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates through these social media platforms to access more educational content and give their feedback. Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Pass your examinations with flying colors.
So far, we noticed that we are very interested in the quantity of a commodity that is available in the market. The quantity that is available of a product or of a commodity in the market is very important, because at the end of the day, the whole idea of production is to make sure that the product reaches the market and is available to consumers in order to create value or utility. Now, we look at two cases that can occur when there's a change in the supply of quantity. What are the things that impact on this quantity supplied, and in what way are they impacted? So the first we are going to consider is the movement along a supply curve, as we have in the diagram on the screen. So in the diagram on the screen, we notice that a change in price from 5 to 10 changes quantity from 100 to 200. And this change is expressed on the supply curve by a movement from point A to point B. Therefore, we describe a movement along the supply curve from one point to the other as a change in quantity that is caused by a change in price. So if price increases from 5 to 10, quantity supplied increases from 100 to 200. And if the reverse happens and price drops from 10 to 5, then there's a change in quantity from 200 to 100. So we say that movement along the supply curve refers to a change in the quantity supplied of a commodity that is caused by a change in price of that commodity, all other factors remaining constant. And as explained, this shows a movement on the supply curve S from point A to B. The only changes in price of good itself, it is only the change in the price of the commodity itself that can cause a movement along the supply curve. And this movement is shown by a change in the quantity of the commodity that is supplied. We look at the other case where we have a shift in the supply curve, either to the right or to the left. This shift also is seen in the quantity of the commodity that is supplied in the market. So we have a shift, for example, outwards, the original supply curve being S, and then we see a shift outwards from A to B, and then we see a shift inwards from A to C. In the case of the shift from A to B, we see an increase in quantity from 100 to 200. And in the case of a shift from A to C, we see a reduction or a change in quantity from 100 to 50. Note that the price remains constant. Therefore, a shift in the supply curve is a change in supply or quantity supply that is occasioned by a change in all other factors except price. So a shift in the supply curve refers to a change in the quantity supplied of the commodity due to factors that are not price related. For example, cost of production that we have mentioned doesn't have anything to do with the price. Weather conditions, for example, doesn't have anything to do with the price. So all these factors that are not price related will cause the supply curve to shift either to the left, either to the right, which is outwards, or to the left, which is inwards. And when the supply curve shifts to the right, then supply rises. In other words, the quantity supplied increases. When it shifts to the left, the quantity supplied reduces or drops. To recap, change in supply can occur either as a result of a change in price or as a result of changes in other factors other than price. When it is as a result of a change in price, we refer to it as a movement, or we see it in a movement along a given supply curve. However, when it is as a result of factors not price related, we see it exhibited in shifts of the supply curve either outwards to the right or inwards to the left. When it is outwards to the right, it denotes an increase in quantity supplied. And when it is inwards to the left, it denotes a decrease in quantity supplied.
Eko Learners Support, a support program of the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education for WAEC and NECO candidates.
Having gone through this, the types of supply, the factors affecting supply, and then the change that we observe in supply, we want to have these questions as revision. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to solve these questions on your own, and then I'll be right back. You're welcome back. So question number 1 asks us to explain how the supply of a commodity is affected by the following: an improvement in technology, 2, a rise in input prices, 3, a rise in prices of other commodities, 4, an increase in government subsidies on production. And then the second question asks us to distinguish with diagrams between movement along a supply curve and shift in the supply curve. In question 1, what is expected of you is to give specific examples to explain how quantity supplied is affected by each of those factors enumerated. So, in the case of technology, the question specifically says improvement in technology. In other words, better technology. Meaning you now have machines, for example, to produce. So we can use the example of mechanized farming as different from using, as different from subsistence, where you use hoes and cutlasses. So the use of tractors, harvesters, plows, and so on is an example of improved technology in farming, and it will most definitely lead to increase in production or increase in quantity supplied, because it will shorten the time that it takes to get the land cultivated. It would increase the acreage that can be cultivated. And then sometimes improved seedlings, which have undergone some technological improvement, can also improve yield. In the second case, a rise in input prices. Inputs are the materials needed for production. So an increase or rise in the price of input prices will definitely increase the cost of production. So if you are producing sachet water, for example, and the cost of sealing machine, the cost of the nylon or polythene bags that you use to bag the water, the cost of the chemicals that you purify the water with, and so on, increase or rise, then the cost of production, the cost of producing one bag of water will increase. All other things being equal, meaning that the producer or the supplier is unable to lay hands on more capital. It therefore means that it would impact on supply by reducing the quantity that is supplied to the market. So the third one, a rise in prices of other commodities. Now, to do good justice to this question, you must differentiate between whether the other commodities here are complements or substitutes. Where the commodities are complements, meaning they are used alongside each other, it means that the rise in price of one will lead to a rise or increase in the quantity of the complement. Why? Because the law of demand or of supply states that the higher the price, the higher the quantity that is made of or offered for sale. Okay, so if there's a rise in the prices of other complementary commodities, the supplier of the complement of the other commodity sees an opportunity to also benefit from the price rise and therefore increase the quantity that is supplied. So in the case of complements, the rise in price of one leads to a rise in price of the other and an increase in the quantity supplied of the commodity. Where there are substitutes, you can be used in place of each other, yes, interchangeably, meaning you can use one or the other. A rise in price in one can have either of two results or impacts. A rise in price of one can, on one hand, also lead to the rise in price of the other, where the producer of the other one, of the substitute, sees an opportunity to benefit from. On the other hand, in competition, where you have many suppliers, a rise in price of one will lead to a drop in the price or an opportunity to increase the quantity supplied of the other one, and then a price. And then finally, increase in government subsidies on production. Earlier on, we used the example of the subsidy that the Nigerian government put on the production, or rather the supply of petroleum. Okay, so if there's an increase in subsidy, if the government makes more subsidy available, it means the government is subsidizing the cost of production, or depending on the industry, the subsidy could also be impacting on the price, meaning that where the cost of production is high, the government decides to say, okay, the price should not be, fixes a maximum price, and therefore and then goes ahead to subsidize the producer with the difference. Okay, either case, where there is an increase in government subsidy on production, it would positively impact on quantity supplied. It will make the quantity that is supplied of that product or commodity to increase. Question 2 says, distinguish with diagrams between movement along the supply curve and shift in the supply curve. We rightly distinguished, or we drew a clear distinction between what happens when there's a movement along a supply curve and when there's a shift in the supply curve. In a movement along a supply curve, for instance, you have just one supply curve. And the movement is necessitated by an increase or reduction in the price of the commodity. So the price of the commodity can either go up, rise, or reduce, decrease, leading to either an increase in the quantity supplied or a reduction in the quantity supplied. But we are talking about one supply curve. So the diagram is simply this. For a movement along the supply curve, you simply have price and quantity. And then the supply curve, of course, rising. Initial price, P1. And then you have a point here, say X. And then the price, for instance, increases to P2. And then you have another point, say Y. When price rises from P1 to P2, quantity, which is Q1, increases to Q2. On the other hand, if there's a drop in price from P1 to P3, quantity also drops from Q1 to Q3. So you now have this point Z. You now have movements along the supply curve from point X to Y or from point X to Z. When it is moving from X to Y, price increases from P1 to P2, necessitating an increase in quantity from Q1 to Q2. When there's a movement along this same supply curve from X to Z, then price is reducing from P1 to P3, necessitating a reduction in the quantity supplied from Q1 to Q3. But in the case of a shift in the supply curve, you are dealing with more than one supply curve. So there is a complete movement or change of location of the supply curve from one point to the other. So if you represent that diagrammatically, you have your initial supply curve being this, and then you can have a shift outwards to another supply curve or a shift inwards to another supply curve, S1, and let's call this S2. And what we have said is that shifts in supply curve are occasioned or happen as a result of the influence of other factors not related to price. So it is a complete distinction from the movement along the supply curve, where the movement along the curve is occasioned by changing price. But for the shift of the supply curve, this happens as a result of all factors or other factors, 1, 2, 3, or more, not related to price. So the factors mentioned in question 1, for example, can lead to shifts in the supply curve. And when you look at this, what you have is a single price, P1. So at that price, you have different quantities where the price line crosses the different supply curves. So these points can be points A, B, and C. and you can have quantities Q1, Q2, and Q3. So what you observe is that when it shifts from the main supply curve outwards from S to S2, you have an increase in quantity supplied. And when it shifts inwards or leftwards from S to S1, you have a reduction in quantity supplied from Q2 to Q1. So that clearly explains the difference or the distinction between the movement along a supply curve and a shift in the supply curve. Remember, in movement along the supply curve, price is the culprit, whereas other factors unrelated to price or not related to price are responsible for shifts of the supply curve, either outwards or inwards. And this brings us to the end of this session. If you have observations or comments, kindly refer to our social media handles displayed on the screen. Thank you and have a good day.